Okay, so what we're going to do today is first we're going to finish up with Hume and then start on Kant. And so just to review, what we left with Hume was that he's an empiricist. He's one of the really famous empiricists, and he's still important. Gerald wrote me, is Gerald's not here, is he? Gerald wrote me, oh
Yep,
yeah, he
I'm here.
is. Yeah, yeah, hi. Um, he wrote me about whether this is still I'm not sure. I don't want to mischaracterize what you wrote, but anyway, Hume, both his ethics and his theory about causality are front and center in to this day in modern science. And an example that I gave him was string theory. The you know Hume doesn't want us to assume the existence is kind of like Occam, doesn't want us to assume the existence of anything we can't actually see. And he says we can't actually see the link between one event and another event, but we call it causation. Well, I forwarded, I don't know, Gerald, whether you saw this, but I forwarded a video by one of my favorite science YouTubers, Sabine Hassenfelder, and
I
it's
missed,
about,
I missed that. Uh,
you missed it?
uh, yeah, I'll go look for that. That sounds cool. Yeah.
It is cool. It's not that long. And the thing is, it is what she's on a tear about. One of her rants is that there's too much money spent in science pursuing uh, what she calls beauty, but what she means is a a theory of the world that actually makes sense and is uh, uh, and her example is the Large Hadron Collider because uh, what we're doing there is, among other things, I don't pretend to understand it. Gerald would be the guy, but anyway, we're pursuing some kind of a grand unified theory, and we're also maybe looking for particles that may explain dark matter to us, and so forth and so on. And this is a really interesting theory, both in philosophy and in science, that well, maybe things don't have to make sense. And there are people that argue this in physics. Gerald, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are people that argue that this is a quixotic pursuit to try to get a theory that matches everything, where everything is consistent and works together. And this has been a problem for 100 years since quantum mechanics came out. And so she
No,
argues
I
about
think
that.
the answer is that looking for consistency. I think it's in the DNA. I couldn't stop it if I had to.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I mean,
but on the other hand, you realize that as human is saying, you get very different levels of correlation between what you decide is a cause and what you think is an effect. And science more and more just says, oh, by the way, I've got a new twist on this for you. And so the answer is there's no way that I can think of that you will know you've gotten to an end. But I think there's a logic to it. It's just that we don't necessarily understand it.
well, that's what the Platonic mindset is. There is a logic to the universe. We're not there yet. We don't get it yet, but there is a logic out there someplace. And that's kind of what Sabina is saying. You're spending a lot of money trying to chase that rabbit, and maybe it'd be better spent elsewhere. Anyway, we can't do that. But just to say, Hume is not somebody that just said what he did and then we moved on from there. He's still front and center in science today and in ethics. And so let me just remind you what he said. There's four things that he says we cannot perceive, that we somehow believe in and think is true, and think are true. And all of those things are things that were assumed by the scholastic philosophers for everybody. Actually, most of them were assumed by every philosopher until now. And they are God, causality, the self, which is the weirdest one, and substance, something called substance. And I said last time, I'm not going to spend much time on that, but uh, and God, that's kind of obvious. We don't have any. I mean, if you're a Christian, you'd say everything is evidence of God's existence, but oh, okay, show me, we don't have an Elisha around to do an experiment with the priests of Baal to demonstrate that God exists. We don't have that. So that we don't have any empirical evidence of God, that is. And substance, I'm not going to deal with too much. I think he's right about this. It's a very interesting point, but it involves us in all kinds of weird, not weird, but technical 20th century logic and stuff. And it's not that important. I, well, I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, we can move beyond it. And then the other thing is the self, and the self is something that's going to be picked up by Kant, which is very interesting. And the point is that the self itself is not perceived. All we see is, if we look inside ourselves, all we see is a bunch of stuff. And Kant is going to say that even if you're looking at your dreams, your memories, your aspirations, all of those are part of the world you perceive. It's not the self itself. They are perceptions. They just happen to be inner perceptions, perceptions of your mind, but they themselves are not your mind. Your mind is still perceiving. If you have a memory, there's something that's remembering, and that thing that's remembering is not perceived. That's what Kant wants to say, and he gets that from Hume. So we're going to talk more about that as we go on. So those are the four things that Hume says we know have no empirical experience of, and this is little bit of a matter of language, but I think we get what he's saying there. And then the other thing that we didn't cover really last time, just much anyway, to review is Kant's ethic. I mean, excuse me, Hume's ethics. And by the way, that first let me go back to the metaphysics a second. This is called Hume's fork, and he says that if you want to say something and it can't be established as a matter of fact, in other words, empirically, or it can't be established logically, which he calls relations of ideas, then it can't be established, and it's just an opinion. And this is going back to Socrates. We're trying to separate opinion from fact. And Hume says those things, one of those things has to be true, or you can't say that what you're saying is legitimate or valid. Um, so that's called Hume's fork. And then there's another thing that's known in the literature as Hume's guillotine, and that's what we talked about last time, that facts do not imply value. And so it's the is, also known as the is ought problem. Hume's guillotine and the is ought problem are the same thing. And it just means that no amount of facts can tell you what's right and wrong. I gave the example of Donald Trump introducing Jesse Jackson last time. Uh, just real quickly, he introduced Jackson and he said Jesse Jackson is going to say a very small number of people control all the or a vast majority of the wealth in the United States. And then Trump says, this is many years ago. And Trump says, but I got to ask myself, what's wrong with that? That's what Trump says. And I don't actually, let's not dwell on that. But he's right about that the fact that a vast amount of wealth is controlled by a small number of people is a fact. Is it right or wrong? Is it good or bad? The facts don't display whether it's good or bad. And then that's when I introduced the parasitic wasps. Uh, and we also talked about the naturalistic fallacy and the moralistic fallacy. Do you want me to review those, or you guys got that? Okay. So, what is Hume going to do with regard to ethics? And he says, he wants to stay away from any kind of metaphysical or religious justification for good and evil, right? He wants to, and he also doesn't want to agree with Hobbes that if you remember, he says that Hobbes says that we think whatever is good benefits us and whatever is evil threatens us, right? And Hume says, well, if that was true, we wouldn't understand the characters in history or literature because they can't hurt us, and yet we have no problem saying whether they're good or evil, right? So this is Hume's criticism of Hobbes' point about that. That's Hobbes' version of nominalism, and nominalism was introduced in the Middle Ages with regard to God's view of right and wrong as opposed to our view, and we could only have our limited human view, whereas God knew what was really true. Nominalism is the idea that our words don't have uh, our words may not be true. What we say is good and evil may not be true. In the eyes of God, uh, good and evil might be something else. So that our words might be wrong. Uh, and Hobbes has it from a different direction. He says he also says it might be wrong, but he doesn't say that it's because God knows what it is. So what Hume says is common sentiment is excuse me, Hume says is moral is common sentiment. So he wants to derive morals from empirical observation. And here he's more or less like Aristotle, which is what you do is just go see what people approve of. And what people approve of is um, is good. Now, he's not so dumb that he thinks that, okay, if everybody approves of, you know, racism, then it's good. He's not saying that. The closest he comes to a definition of goodness is that we find by observation, we can see that people think the good is what is useful. And if you're doing something that is useful to society, then it's good. And I could point out that this is an interesting, also contrary view to Hobbes, because suppose I have a job and I don't know, in a warehouse or something, and I see there's somebody that's a much better worker than I am. Now, according to Hobbes, that guy is my rival and he's a threat to me. But in fact, Hume wants to say, no, I admire that guy. I go, man, that guy is, and we admire people who are hard workers who can do things better than we can, even though their abilities may threaten our position at the company. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You admire somebody that's good at something. And if Hobbes were right, we wouldn't admire that person. But we do admire them. And Hume says it's because the common sentiment is that they're doing something useful and therefore it's good. Does that make sense? Now, I must say I admire Hume's humility on this point. He's not, we feel so strongly about um, moral positions. We feel so emotional about them that we want to ground them into something that's weighty. And so that's why we use God or we use um, sociology or some kind of thing. And Hume is holding back from that. He's not going to try to base it on some kind of metaphysical principle or God or any higher principle, which we'll get to with Kant and Mill, by the way. He's not going to do that. He's just going to say, all I can say, and like I say, I like the humility of this. All I can say is this is what people approve of. And some people call him the first utilitarian because he says what's useful. And Mill's going to say, of course, what makes for the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Bentham and Mill, we'll talk about it in not today, but they were the utilitarians, Bentham and Mill. And Hume doesn't go there, but he does say that we find things that are useful. The common sentiment is that things that are useful are beneficial, are good. So I just kind of like the humility of that, the not trying to base his morals on some kind of highfalutin principle. So we're going to move on to Kant now. Does anybody have any questions about Hume they want to address or further discussion of Hume? All right. Okay, Kant is the first guy we're going to come to who is just uh, a piece of work. Uh, it's impossible that his big work is a critique of pure reason, and this is a monster work, and it's the kind of book that you can read a paragraph 40 times and you know the same thing you did before you read the first word. He's very incomprehensible, very difficult to read, and part of the reason is that he makes up new terms. He's saying something quite new, and he's very, very important. He's saying something quite new, and he makes up new terms which he doesn't necessarily define or use consistently. One of the big favorite terms in Kant is transcendental. We'll get into that. It sounds really important, and it is, but it's not quite as spiritual or whatever as it sounds. We'll try. We'll do our best to define that. By the way, hello, Peter and Ann, and welcome back. Good to see you. And you look at least cheery. I don't know, and you look well, but you're probably not quite well yet.
I'm going home Saturday.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
Yep.
That's not very long off.
Nope. A little scary, but they said I'm totally ready. Yep.
Scary. I'd be so relieved to get out of there. It's like
No, I
prison.
actually really like it here. I really do. I've discovered, like when I got back from the hospital, I discovered, oh my God, I really like it here, compared to the hospital. The food at the hospital was really good.
Wow.
But everything else is like, this has become a kind of little turtle shell home, you know?
Turtle shell home.
Yeah, I mean, like the people here are really nice, really nice.
I
The PT people, the nurses, the aides, they're characters.
I don't, I in the last year or two had to visit doctors or and their assistants and nurses and stuff like that. And these people are different species. They are just something special. And I've been telling them that. I my whole life I just took healthcare for granted. You go in and you see the doctor, whatever, do what he says. But these people have chosen to live an entire life caring for other people.
Yeah, I
That's
know.
some kind of life decision that I could never have made. And I've
Yeah,
been I've been passing that along to them. I hope it doesn't make them uncomfortable, but I kind of don't care because it makes me feel like they've been recognized. They don't respond that way. Usually one girl started to cry when I told her that. It's
yeah,
such a wonderful life choice she made. Anyway, back to
Let me say,
philosophy.
I'll just say, Tony, they appreciate,
yeah, they do.
especially right now, because they are under siege from so many different things, and so many people went through a terribly, we lost a lot of people during COVID because they just couldn't
Yeah,
deal with it anymore. So if people who stuck it out and are still there and working, anything you can do to make their lives easier and say that you appreciate them it's really welcome. My
Well, it's
my
sincere. They're all
colleagues
angels.
tell me they appreciate it.
I
Good.
agree. I agree.
Oh, okay, so back to our hard job here, Kant. Yeah, he's a piece of work. The critique of pure reason. I don't suppose you guys really want to get further into this, but I would recommend just reading Norman Kemp Smith's. I think it's called a commentary on the critique of pure reason. That's written in actual English, and well, Kant didn't write in English, to be fair, but he's very, very difficult to read, and that's going to be true of a couple of guys now. Hegel is hard to read. Some of Marx is very hard to read, but Kant is really hard to read. And where's McEntee? Geez, he wrote me yesterday. He said the link didn't work, and so I tried to lead him through it. I said, "Get on here today, and if get on early, and if you don't manage to get on, then call me." But that hasn't happened. He's not here. Anyway, we used to say at Pomona, it's an old farm expression, and a reading Kant is like a hog looking at a wristwatch. You feel like a hog looking at a wristwatch. You just, what the hell am I looking at here? And then now I've studied him quite a bit, but when I go to talk about him, Another farm expression is my mind is flopping around like a wounded snake. And that's how I feel like so many ideas come to mind, and I'll try to congeal them in a format that is somewhat comprehensible. It's very important. One thing to say about Kant is, in my view, this is the first really important answer to Plato uh, since Plato, and the other one is going to be Wittgenstein. Plato has not been put to rest, and Hume doesn't put him to rest either. The problem with Hume is that, well, Hume and Aristotle, the problem with trying to derive everything from empirical evidence is basically the Meno. Uh, the Meno can't be answered by either Aristotle or any of the empiricists. Hume, how do you explain the Meno? Because somebody has knowledge that they have not specifically. That's the demonstration in the Meno. Somebody has knowledge of slave boy that hasn't been learned or experienced prior to his little discussion with Socrates. So how do you explain that? And uh, I compared it, if you remember, to the monarch butterflies who fly from Mexico to Canada and back, and it takes several generations. So how does the second and third generation know how to complete the trip? Well, this is the Mino is even worse than that because at least in the case of the monarch butterfly, somebody has previously learned something physical. But the things that the slave boy knows, nobody learned from something physical. The intuitions of mathematics, and I have mentioned this before, if you go to Wikipedia and look up the philosophy of mathematics, the intuitions of mathematics have not been explained to this day. In other words, the Meno has not been accounted for to this day. That sounds crazy, but I think you'll find it's correct. So uh, Kant is going to undertake the first real answer to this question, and the second one's going to be Wittgenstein. Nobody between Plato and Kant, including Aristotle, and certainly not Aquinas or any of the Christians, or Descartes, or Hobbes, or any of these guys, have had some kind of response to the Meno, and Kant's going to have one. That's why well, one of the reasons why he's so important. He's also important for ethics, which we will also cover. I think I mentioned just this is not that germane, but Kant is also the guy who originated the Kant-Laplace theory for the formation of the solar system,
Yeah.
and that has nothing to do with philosophy, but it's just kind of amazing that this guy's mind could, and that's still the theory, the working theory of how the th solar system came to be. Yeah, Peter.
Another thing that I just learned recently, Kant said that some of the nebulae were probably universes in their own right, like the Milky
Yes.
Way. And that was not confirmed until 1924, but it's been very strongly confirmed. And I don't think even Laplace was interested in that idea. He developed the nebular hypothesis, but I don't think he paid attention to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it is amazing how many of these guys, I mentioned this before, were kind of prescient. Even if they didn't know exactly what the physics were, Kant wouldn't have known enough about the standard model and all that to really have the sophistication that Gerald has about modern physics. But just the fact that he could figure this out, or that Thales could figure out that, and the atomists could figure out there must be something that is permanent that never goes in and out of existence. Yeah, Doug.
Yeah, I have Walter Kaufman's Critique of Religion and Philosophy. Do you think
Yeah,
that that's a worthwhile
I like Kaufman.
commentary on Kant?
Yeah, I like Kaufman.
Okay.
He came to Pitzer one time. I saw him speak. And Kaufman, I don't want to get sidetracked here, but Kaufman is a Jew who was the guy who was responsible for re-establishing Nietzsche as an important guy, because Nietzsche gave birth to Rosenberg. Rosenberg was the one of the main philosophers of the Third Reich. Nietzsche in his later life went kind of nuts, and his sister Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, I think, took over his papers, and she was like a Nazi type sympathizer and racist, and she guided his publications towards emphasizing those kinds of, Aryan superiority kind of things. And so by the end of World War II, Nietzsche was in very bad odor. And Kaufman, who's a Jew, went back and reevaluated Nietzsche and brought him back into respectability, which he remains to this day. That's just kind of an interesting little biographical story there. Anyway, going back to Kant. So um, I made the rather bold statement that Kant's the first guy that has kind of an answer to the Meno. The first one, what, a couple of thousand years, and nobody's really come up with any kind of credible explanation for what's going on in the Meno. So what happens with Kant? He creates something that he calls the Copernican revolution in philosophy. And what that is you'll know that Copernicus realized that the motions of the heavenly bodies were not caused because they were moving. They were apparent motion caused by our movement. And so none of the heavenly bodies were moving around circling the earth. We were moving around and it made them look like they were moving. Now, he calls his philosophy the Copernican revolution in philosophy because all of the philosophers until Kant had assumed that the mind was kind of a passive thing, like and what was going on out there was actually real. In other words, the just like when we look at the stars, we think their motion is real when it's actually us that's moving. But for Kant, what he wants to say is the world that we see with our senses is actually a creation of our mind. And we shouldn't confuse this with it being, again, it's not like Maya, it's not an illusion. And, we luckily, since I've started teaching philosophy, there's been a development in technology that gives us a good analogy to understand what he's saying, and that is the development of personal computers. Um, the example of a photographic plate is often used. Imagine a photographic plate is like your mind, and it's just recording what's out there. But in order for it to do that, it has to have a certain chemical structure. And a computer or a digital camera to receive pixels uh, doesn't know anything except that they're pixels. It doesn't know anything at all. It just represents these pixels. For the computer to understand what's going on or make any sense of it, it has to have an operating system and software. And we can compare what uh, Kant is trying to say to an operating system, that our mind has an operating system. And that operating system doesn't just merely passively receive the sense data from our eyes and ears and so forth. It organizes it and shapes it in a way that's useful to us. And so Kant calls this the transcendental illusion, the illusion that the world that we see outside our minds is a real world. And in fact, it's a highly processed world. It's not a world that is just received passively by this thing, uh, by our mind and perception. It isn't perceived passively. It's been organized and sorted out according to the structures that are inherent in human consciousness. Are you with me so far? I mean, actually, on one level, this is obvious. Of course, you have your ideas of things and I have my ideas of things. Kant's saying something a little bit deeper than this, I think. Now, when he starts to, the way he goes about figuring it out, he says, we can't see the world without it being framed or organized through our consciousness, right?
Right.
So how are we going to say anything about the thing that's organizing uh, the perceptions that we have? I mean, bless their hearts, all these guys for thousands of years just sat down and tried to figure out how our minds work, how what reality is. I mean, that's awfully sweet of them. Yeah, Doug.
But does Kant believe that there's a mind independent reality out there, or
Okay, that's an interesting question because how can we answer that question? Uh, how can we? There, he does have a way of responding to your question, and I'll get to that. But we couldn't know anything about it. Let's put it that way. Now, uh, what Kant says
I don't
is,
interrupt that.
Peter, you got something?
Yeah, I have read only one book by Kant. I don't know much about him, but I believe he said somewhere that the supposed metaphysical question whether the real world exists was a scandal to philosophy. And his answer was more or less, of course it exists, but we can't perceive it as it is in itself. We have to perceive it through the categories of our mind. I could be wrong about that, but I
No,
think I read that
that's all
somewhere.
correct. That's all correct. Except saying it's a real world that's out there is slightly
Yeah, it's
more than it's
problematic.
more than he wants to say about it.
Uh-huh.
I'll try to put it that way. Um, Okay, so the structures that the way he goes about trying to, okay, what he's going to try to do is figure out what is the mind doing and how is the mind processing the external world so that we have the perceptions that we're familiar with. How does it do that? And the way he does it is called what he calls the transcendental deduction. Like I said, he likes the word transcendental. So this is a transcendental deduction. And actually, the best analog for this was given by our own W.T. Jones from Pomona College. He's given the my favorite simple analog for what Kant says we're doing here. Jones says, suppose you go into a warehouse and you see 4 or 5 stacks of piles of oranges, and if you look at the oranges, you can see that some are smaller than others, and you can measure them and sort them according to that. And then some have different colors from others, and you can gauge them according to that and sort them. So, what can we say about the person or the entity that was sorting the oranges? Well, they were sorting them according to color and size. So that's what we're going to do. What Kant says we do is we start with the things we can perceive, and it's like a crime scene. We figure out, well, what had to happen for us to perceive the world the way we're perceiving it? What kind of organization had to occur so that we come up with the picture that we have? Uh, and what he says is there are 4 things that he can identify that the mind organizes reality in accordance to. One of them is space, so that we see things in space. Now, again, Kant's being kind of prescient here because the space really exists. Look at the general theory of relativity. Look at Einstein. He says, well, space is kind of relative to, and it can bend. We wouldn't think space could bend, the space that we live in. So we're shaping our space according to our human consciousness. And one of the funny things that I think Kant says this is that we can imagine space being empty, but we can't imagine there being no space. That is kind of a weird thing to say. So anyway, one of the things we can say is that you're where you are and I'm where I am. So we perceive the world in as having spatial qualities, things being organized according to location. The second thing is time. So again, time is one of those things that Einstein uh, and couple hundred years later, Einstein says, well, time is relative. Time isn't a fact of the universe. And so uh, Kant calls space the outer sense, and he calls time the inner sense. So time's always going along, even when if we have our eyes closed, we have no sense of space. If we're in one of those sensory deprivation chambers, anybody ever do one of those? Where you, yeah, I did one time. They give you, they put you in a chamber, and the whole idea is they try to block out any kind of sensation of anything. So you can't hear anything. They put a mask on you. You lie down so you're not standing up. And I think ideally you're in water. I don't remember whether it's in water or not. So you don't experience gravity. Anyway, the idea is that even in that situation, time is moving forward. Even if you have no sense of space, time is moving forward and you have an inner sense of that. Looks like I'm getting frozen here. I don't know why that is. Anyway, so the two things the mind is doing to organize your experience are time and space. And so he doesn't want to claim that time and space are real things. And again, this is like kind of what Einstein says. The third thing is causality, which Hume called attention to, that we don't perceive causality. And the fourth one has the greatest title. It's called the um, transcendental unity of apperception. And that phrase refers to uh, the fact that everything you experience happens to you in a nexus. Your consciousness, the one that Hume says you can't see, that he described Kant describes this by saying it's the transcendental unity of apperception. And all over, in other words, all the perceptions that you have of the outside world are occurring to this one unity of apperception that you know who you are. And Kant has various. Kant wrote two versions of the Critique of Pure Reason. One is published in 1781 and another one in 1787, and they're not the same, and they don't use the same arguments to produce the same results. It's just a mess. And if he wasn't a genius, we would just say he's a disorganized fool, but he was a genius. So um, the uh, transcendental unity of apperception is, he actually has arguments to prove this is the case. And one of the famous ones is the bell. And he says that if you hear a church bell, you hear one um, strike of the bell, and then you hear another strike of the bell. What had to happen for that to happen? Well, there had to be an ongoing, continual consciousness, or you wouldn't remember the first strike. The thing that's experiencing the world wouldn't remember the first strike. So there must be a continuing consciousness. Now, the transcendental deduction is what it is he's looking at all of our perceptions and he's saying what kind of sieve, what kind of sorting, what kind of categories had to be at work here to present to us finally the picture of the world that we get. And he says, whatever it is, it's something that has organized our consciousness with regard to time, space, causality, and the transcendental unity of apperception. Whew. Um, Now, to return to, I think it was Doug's question or somebody's question about whether there's a real world out there. So what Kant wants to say is, and this is kind of in response to Hume, well, a lot of it is in response to Hume. Hume was at pains to demonstrate that it was not possible to go from the perceived world, which he called matters of fact, to the not perceived world, in other words, God. Because he's going to say that causality, let's just take the first proof for the existence of God from Thomas Aquinas. He's going to say that causality is not something we see. So Thomas trying to say that, well, we perceive in the world, we see this thing called causality, and it must have a beginning. It must logically go back to something that's the first cause, and that's God. That's Thomas's first proof. And so Hume wants to say that, well, we never perceive causality, even in the world that we can perceive. And then you're saying there's some kind of logical force to it that would require us to believe that all the way back to the beginning and beyond anything we could perceive, there is something that started it all. And on a couple in a couple of different ways, Hume wants to say that's just it's just not possible to go from here to there. You can't make a proof of something that's metaphysical and not perceptible by using evidence in the world that is perceptible. And Kant calls that world, that's the world that we perceive, uh, similar to Plato's world of perception. He calls it the phenomenal world. The phenomenal world is the world we experience. And all of the laws that, all of the things he just mentioned, time, space, causality, and the uh, transcendental unity of apperception, all of those things are preconditions for us having experienced anything, but they aren't part of the quote real world. And he calls that real world the noumenal. He wants to, it's best to think of the phenomenal world as a limit. This is as far as we can go. And what's beyond that? What's causing our perceptions? What is the origin of our transcendental, our own individual transcendental unities of apperception? Those things are things beyond the phenomenal. We don't experience them. We don't experience ourself. In other words, the thing that's doing the perceiving, we don't experience that. We don't experience the actual causes of our perceptions that are out there because they're all filtered through our these structures in consciousness that organize them in a way that's useful to us. We don't experience those things. So the famous quote from Kant is, I limited uh, rationality to make room for faith. So the things that are beyond that wall of the phenomenal world that we perceive, those have to be addressed with faith because there's no way they can be proven. And he also like Hume, he doesn't think these arguments that have been produced are legit, that prove the existence of God. And Kant does something, he produces something called the antinomies, which are really hilarious. I mean, it's like Hume, it's some kind of joke against the entire history of philosophy. Here, I've got him here. The antinomy, what he does is he takes the assumptions of scholastic philosophy and he proves, well, I'll just give you here's the first antinomy, mathematical. The thesis, the world has a beginning in time and a limit in space. Antithesis, the world has no beginning in time and no limit in space. And what he does, there's four of these. And what Kant does is prove using the rules of scholastic analysis and rational thinking and argument, he proves that both of those are true. Both this and its opposite are true, and he does it for four things. What he's doing is demonstrating the futility of scholastic types of reasoning. The other antinomies, just for your amusement, are um, every complex substance consists of simple parts, or nothing in the world consists of simple parts. The third one is causality in accordance with the law of nature is not sufficient to explain the existence of freedom. Antithesis, there is no freedom, but everything happens according to the laws of nature. Then there exists a necessary being either within or with outside the world, or outside the world there is no necessary being. And he he goes through these elaborate proofs of every one of these things according to the rules of scholastic reason, and proves both the thing and their opposite. It's kind of a pimp job, he just makes fun of the entire, but of course he does it in very dignified language. He wouldn't say pimp job, for example. He's always Kant himself was a very prim kind of conservative guy. They used to say you could set your watch by when uh, Kant left his office. He was so prompt and organized. And Kant was a professor too, by the way. Not all these guys were professors, but he was. So the upshot of this is, let me get back to the thing I opened with, or maybe I didn't open with it, but I mentioned the Meno. So how do we explain the Meno? Well, Kant is going to say something like this. The reason that we know what mathematics is it's part of the structure, like space, time, and causality, of given to us in our minds. It's part of the organizing principle of our mind through which we perceive reality. Beyond that, we can't say. He calls it, I hesitate to use this, but anyway, in the history of philosophy up until him, we made, and I've referred to the distinctions between um, analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic statements are the ones that are true by virtue of the definitions of the terms used in the statement, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. And a synthetic statement has to bring something from outside. In other words, that you can't just look at the logic of the terms, you have to actually bring in evidence. And then the other terms are a priori and a posteriori, which are very similar. And a priori is things we know before sense experience, and a posteriori is things we know after sense experience. So Kant is going to say very famously that there is such a thing as a priori synthetic facts or truths. And that means these are the preconditions from which or according to which we experience the world. They're necessary and established before experience. So, in order that experience can occur, if these things didn't exist, experience wouldn't happen. That's his conclusion. So these statements, like the organizing of space, time, etc., are preconditions for any kind of experience. So they are a priori. They are prior to experience. But on the other hand, they're not analytic either. It's not obvious just from the logic of the terms involved that these are true. Something has been added to the logic of our statements. Some conclusion has been come to that we have proof of just because of the preconditions of experience. Without those structures in our brain, and then he has 12 categories, which I don't think I'm going to bother with that, but he has 12 categories uh, according to which the mind is sifting the perceptions that it receives. Those perceptions, his term for that is the manifold. The manifold you can think of as like all the billions of photons that are coming into your mind at any or your sight at any second. That's the manifold. All this junk that you're continually perceiving through your physical perceptions, hearing, um, taste, smell, vision. That data is massive that's coming in every second to your mind. And he calls that bunch of what we call in the 20th century sense data. He calls all that stuff, his word is manifold for it. And then what we do is process that manifold. And if we didn't have any processing, we'd be just like a digital camera that didn't know what it was looking at. It was receiving all this information, but it had not even the faintest iota of what was being perceived. But we sift it through the structures that he describes, and that's what comes up with the picture of reality that arrives in our consciousness, our transcendental unity of apperception. That is the essence of Kant, what I've just said. And so, to boil it down even more simply, the mind is not a passive, but is an active uh, recipient or participant in perception. It's not passive. It's uh, and that's why he calls it the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Yeah, Barry.
This what this makes me think of is Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury, when he's trying to communicate what Benji is perceiving or how he's thinking about or understanding the world, because he doesn't have the structures that you talk about, those sorting, those things that are the operating system for his mind is not functioning properly. So impressions and sensory information is just coming at him in a completely unstructured way. And he communicates that in the way he writes about that character. It just seems like a similar idea.
Yeah, we do benefit from the fact that we know what an operating system is. This didn't exist in Kant's time, but you can imagine if you had a different operating system. I've mentioned before that even perceiving, do you remember Plato's statement, his myth of the sun or analogy of the sun, that the mind is to the forms as the eye is to the sun, and the sun, it turns out that our eye is tuned to the same light frequency curve that the sun puts out. And I think I mentioned that if we were on another planet around a different star, our eyes might be sensitive to a different curve uh, than we are sensitive to. Same with ears, I suppose. They've been developed because they are useful to us in a way that, say, a bee needs ultraviolet light, so he sees another part of the spectrum. Alan, did you have a point?
Yeah, I was going to say that you see support for Kant's idea that the structure of the brain uh, has a lot to do with how we experience and perceive the outside world from developmental psychology. So, for example, there's empirical evidence that's been reproduced many times that a newborn infant will tend to staring at human faces to look at eyes and to begin to recognize faces within hours of birth. And, I think stretching that to what you were just saying about the wavelength of lights and things like that, if you imagine what the world looks like to a butterfly, where perhaps the most important thing in the life of a butterfly is flowers, that there's an intense awareness of flowers and things like houses and street lights and things like that are probably completely irrelevant data that the butterfly simply doesn't notice. Um, I would imagine that viewing the world or experiencing the world as a bloodhound, you're going to be aware of all thousands of scents that were laid down hours before, days before. You're kind of looking at a historical view of where other creatures have passed and left scent trails that human beings have zero awareness of. And so I think that how different brains experience the world can be extremely different.
Yeah, yeah, on that level, it's pretty obvious that Kant is right, just from our experience of other animals, and we, yeah, for sure know well. Birds, for example, there are birds that this has been demonstrated, that can look up at the sky and just glance up at the sun and see which direction it's going. We can't do that. We'd have to. There's a trick to do that if you're a Boy Scout and you know how to do, you know how to do that. But we can't just glance up at the sun and see which direction it's going. But there are birds that can do. Birds that have a magnetic sense for where the magnetic poles are. There's uh, fish that have electromagnetic sensors that can sense the electric field of other fish's brains, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, all this kind of consciousness, and then we have our own operating system. Um, Laurel, let me say one thing before I forget it, and then I'll get to your point. Um, at the beginning of this, I said that there are two guys that respond significantly to Plato. One is Kant, and the other is Wittgenstein. Kant says that these are structures of the brain. They're kind of like the forms of Plato's forms. But in Plato's forms, those are kind of something that you perceive from or you remember. My memories are not part of the structure of my consciousness. They're part of it. A minute ago, I was talking about the inner sense. You have subjective feelings, you have memories, you have hopes and dreams. Those are still not you. They are objects of your awareness. My memories are not me. I am focusing my attention. It's just that they're inside my brain as opposed to being outside in the world. But there's still something that is not the same as being me. And so, in a sense, the forms are perceived by the mind through memory. Whereas Kant wants to say they're not perceived, they are the structures through which we perceive. So that this is the first alternative in the history of philosophy for the view that Plato had. Now we've talked, we mentioned a couple of things about, like Alan, I think you mentioned about the babies. Uh, the an analogous thing with Kant, I think what he mentions is you can't help yourself but see that the world is curved. The one I always use for this is when we look down the street, the people only look this tall. Why do they look that tall? We know that they're not that tall. Well, it's a structure of our brain that organizes, two-dimensional, our two eyes, allows us to figure out perspective. But it's a way that we structure the world that we perceive so that it's useful to us. But it's actually not what the world is. The world, the people aren't that big. But in order for us to make use of the perceptions that we're getting in our eyes, we have to see them that way so we can structure the space, which is one of the things that Kant said our brains use to structure the world. One of the uh, structures it filters the world through. That's the way our brains function. So with Plato, those things were something you learned or remembered from a former life. But Kant says they're prior to that. They are the structures through which you remember, no, that you experience even your memories. Laurel, sorry.
I think Alan's comment on developmental psychology is very interesting, but I think we also learn an enormous amount from neuroscience, from strokes or other things where brains are affected and where people can actually describe the alteration in our understanding of the world around us, and all kinds of things that our brains do we can actually characterize, not just by when it's working, by what happened, but by what happens when it's not working. And Oliver Sacks has a number of books that
Yeah.
describe these phenomena. But I was wondering to what extent Kant had any exposure to such descriptions, which go way back, but before the modern neuroscience, people have described alterations in understanding the world. But that I think is and there are all sorts of other weird things, like people who are blind have hearing function taking over a lot of the pieces of the brain that dealt with vision, and language structure. If you're using ASL, the brain is also very plastic. So it's not just that you're born with a brain that is structured to do things. It can also rearrange itself in interesting ways to deal with this. And so your perception of yourself can be rearranged. Um, in
That's very interesting. Of course, Kant knew none of this. This is modern science that we've now. When you say that Kant must have experienced it, no, he doesn't talk about this. And yeah, I there's probably a good chance that he's run into somebody that I don't know is uh, has some kind of disability mentally that causes a different, well, just a blind person for starters. I have a personal thing that just happened to me that's kind of interesting along these lines. I had an operation. One of my ears was blown out in a rock and roll show 20 years ago or more. And I happened to mention this to a doctor, and he says, "Oh, there's an operation for that at Kaiser." And so I went and had the operation. What they do is, I can't remember the name. There's a couple little bones. Somebody's going to know this. A couple little bones in your ear, and you can actually go in there and put a prosthetic in. He says what's happened is the bone has been shattered, and so we just put a plastic substitute in the ear. This microsurgery. Anyway, the point is, it completely rearranged my taste. So things taste very weird to me and not very good to me now. Everything's like cardboard. Not everything. It's specific. Some things are still fine and other things are not good. And supposedly this is going to go away. And this is to your point about the malleability of the brain. Supposedly, Laurel, over a period of time, the brain is going to rewire itself. And so the old experience of the sensation of taste is going to uh, uh, configure itself so that things are normal again. That's very weird. But anyway, all that stuff is true, and it's again an example of how one of these philosophers just Kant didn't do it that way. That's not the way Kant came to these conclusions. He came to the conclusions by doing just what I said, looking at what the world that we perceive is like and what like I said, is transcendental deduction what must be the case for us to be perceiving the world the way we are? That was the thought process that he arrived at these things from, not from examples in the real world. Somebody else had their hand up a second ago? No? Okay. So, Kant,
Sorry, I was on mute. I just asked you, well, how is your
oh,
hearing now?
Oh, the hearing's improved.
Okay.
It's sir, I don't know what whether the cost is worth it because uh but supposedly it's the taste is going to come back. I I knew about this, but the thing was it may take a month or two or even up to a year to come back. Well, it looks like I'm going to be the long range on the long range end of that because it's been quite a while since I had the operation. But yeah, things are tasting very strange. But thanks for asking. Uh, just a couple more uh, things I want to say about Kant, and then I'll. This is exhausting, at least for me, to have to go through all these. Not have to. I loved doing this actually, but just um, there's a couple more things I want to mention. And okay, they are just these terms. The manifold, I've already mentioned a manifold, and that is all the sensory experience that is flowing into our senses at every moment. Intuition is knowledge which is immediate relation to the senses. In other words, uh, let me see if I can do. You know how sometimes you mistake you're walking along and you see something that's in the shadows and you think it's one thing, but that turns out it's another. Well, in addition to sight, what's going on there is the mind is making an interpretation instantaneously. This is kind of an amazing thing. I mean, if you think about what's happening, you see something and you mistake it for something else. Well, just think about what happened. The mind has instantly gone through its whole database of things that look like that. You could do this with in Chrome, there's something called Lens. So if you show your phone a flower, it'll look through its database of similar looking flowers and identify what it is. Well, that's what your mind is doing when you mistake, oh, that's Sally. No, it's Mary. And what your mind has done is it's gone through all the similar images instantaneously, way faster than you can appreciate. It knows right away, okay, it's not a car, it's not an elephant, it's not a mountain, it's a female, but it looks like Mary, no, it's Sally, whatever. It does that so quickly that you don't even know what it is. So anyway, I think that's what Kant means by an intuition, that your mind um, uh, understands what it is it's looking for. That's not the same thing as the manifold. The manifold is the um, interpreted flow of data, what we call sense data. Um, and that is caused, that sensation is caused by something from the noumena that we don't know what the sensation is caused by. We can't say it because all of our sensations are filtered through those categories I just mentioned to you. And then that's the world of phenomena, the world of perceived things. And then a subjective deduction. Um, okay, I'm not going to go to that one today. Maybe I'll do it next time. And I could go through the categories too, but I think I'll skip it. I think this is enough uh, confusion for the day. Final thing I want to say is that what's going to happen after Kant, and we're not done with him, but what's going to happen is that Hegel's going to come along and say, well, if the mind is creatively involved in understanding the world, can the mind not change through time? I don't, do I perceive the same world that I perceived when I was 10 or when I was 20? And he's going to say, no, the mind goes through a dialectic process and changes through time. That's what we'll get to Hegel. So without Kant, saying that the mind is creatively engaged in projecting to us a picture of the world, and isn't just passive. There would have been no Hegel to say, well, if that's the case, then the mind and the operating system that goes with understanding the world can change as we live our lives. That's all I'm going to say about Kant today. Any comments? Your comments have been really good so far. Any other comments, questions, criticisms? Barry.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think, connecting to what Alan was talking about development in newborns, and also what Laura was talking about in when the brain is not functioning properly, when the operating system is disrupted, it occurs to me that the experience of psychedelic drugs is another
Yeah.
example of this.
Yeah.
Um, where the drugs are at a biochemical level are interfering with the basic operating system structures, but yet perceptions and the result are all different kinds of perceptions of reality, which also relates to mental illness and schizophrenia and things like that.
Boy, you'd really like to sit down with Kant and ask him about that, wouldn't you?
Hallucination is so fascinating. I mean, my mother
Yeah,
went
and
through a period at the end of her life where she began hallucinating experiences, and they were patently impossible. And yet she was absolutely convinced that it had happened. For example, she knew that she had been bitten by a raccoon, and she had this vivid memory of the raccoon biting her, and yet she was a little old lady cooped up inside of a house. I mean, there was no way that she could possibly have been attacked by a raccoon, but you could not talk her out of it. I mean, she said, "No, I experienced it. It's vivid. My memory of it is so vivid that I know that it happened." And those kinds of experiences, along with hallucination under drugs, in a way makes you realize that your ordinary perception is only possible if your brain chemistry is working in a particular way
Yeah.
that we interpret as normal.
Yeah. Lewy body dementia, Alan. My mother had again, a very weird perception. She informed me that she couldn't use one of you shouldn't use the bathroom next to her bedroom in my parents' apartment because when they were in uh, assisted living, because there was a body on the floor and we had to wait. It was yellow tape. We had to wait till the police had cleared it, and all sorts of bizarre delusions as well as some visual hallucinations. And again, you could restrict that with the atypical antipsychotics. So we had this big argument about that because there's a black box warning for older people against them because they increase the risk of stroke or heart attack about 5 to 10% over the next 5 years. And explaining that my mother was 97 and was worried about um, people falling off roofs and being kidnapped, and that I didn't actually worry too much about the 10% risk of a heart attack when she was 102. But, I had to deal with the doctor stuff. But yeah, the mental disorders are fascinating. I've been in that research world now for 40 years. So
Yeah, Peter.
We're talking about delusions and hallucinations. That's an important subject, but there's also the possibility, which I think maybe Barry was raising, that altering the brain chemistry, for example, by psychedelic drugs, may make us see things that we have no way of judging as, say, they're not real. We may be seeing deeper. We may not be able to know what to make of what we see, but we may still be seeing deeper. William James, who had some experience with drugs and took both drug experience and religious experience very seriously, I think says somewhere, how do we know that 98.6 degrees is a better temperature for perceiving the world than, say 104? It wasn't that he actually thought, one was superior to the other, but he was raising, I think, a legitimate question. What is the absolute base for reality when you get beyond like perceiving bodies that aren't there or thinking you were bitten by a raccoon that isn't there? How do you judge?
We're not going to resolve all this stuff today, but if I could just revert back to Plato for one more thing, just to make a comparison between Plato and Kant. Remember, Plato said that the forms uh, are actual parts of reality, the universe.
Mhm.
And the unsettling thing about Kant is he doesn't make that claim. He says these are the structures through which our brain um, formulates a picture of reality. But the noumena, the stuff on the other side, the limit of the quote phenomenal world is will always remain unknown to us and it cannot be known, which is a little unsettling, I guess. Doug, you had your hand up? Was it Doug? No, somebody put up a digital hand, I thought.
Yeah, Doug says William Blake has a lot to say about this in
Oh,
Bridge of Heaven and
Yeah.
Hell.
on chat is on chat.
Mhm.
Sorry.
Which is very true.
Yeah, this is the area of poets and religious seers and so forth, the noumenal world. And that's exactly what Kant says. He says uh, I make I put a limitations on knowledge to make room for faith. And he was, I have not been able to determine whether he was a devout. I know he was very pious in his life and his lifestyle. He and I just don't know here. He may have been a devout Christian also. I kind of doubt that, but he could have been. If so, he wasn't a traditional Christian, that's for sure. Uh, Gerald says, "Got to go. Miss this conversation for the rest of July." Oh, for the rest of July on caretaker duty. Okay. All right, Gerald. I'm sorry to hear that.
Me too, but I'll listen into the, I'll be able to watch the videos, but at that time of the morning I've got duties.
Hey, that
It's
reminds
life.
me of another thing that occurred to me, which is, does anybody, I should have brought this up a long time ago. Does anybody have questions about have you watched the videos and had questions? Because those are all valid. If you just weren't here, but you watched the video and you wanted to say something, but you weren't there to say it. Um, you can either bring that up anytime or else you can write me. I'm happy to respond to emails about any of these questions. I got nothing else to do. I'm an old guy with no job or anything, so I'd be happy to do that. And so if you do watch the videos and have a question, just get back to me. Uh, all right. Um, I guess we'll call it a day here. That's been another long one. And I will see you on Tuesday. We'll continue with Kant and we'll start talking about the his ethics. Uh, and that's very important too. The metaphysics is important, but the ethics are at least as important. So we'll talk about that next time, and I will see you then.
Thank you. Have a good
Tony.
weekend, everybody.
Happy 4th of July.
Yeah.